Marvel is filled with so many strong female characters, heroes, villains, and even civilians, but so often they are either underrepresented or are just straight up done dirty when it comes to their inclusion in the comics. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda, and today we're counting down the top 10 strongest women of Marvel who honestly deserve better. Who is your favorite female character from Marvel Comics? And what do you think about how they're portrayed? Number 10. Captain Marvel. In the comic book Avengers issue 197, published in 1980, Carol Danvers, who is then known as Miss Marvel, discovers that she is pregnant. However, she has no recollection of how it happened, and the baby grows at an alarming rate. Shortly after that, in Avengers issue 200, Carol gives birth to the baby, who also grows up at an alarming rate, and names himself Marcus. The Avengers seem excited about the birth, despite the bizarre circumstances of it, and Carol is made to feel like she is basically overreacting by not sharing in their enthusiasm and excitement for her. As Marcus grows, it is revealed that he is actually the son of Immortus, a ruler of Limbo, not Magic's Limbo, but a different Limbo. Immortus, by the way, is one of the alternate timeline incarnations of Kang the Conqueror. Immortus had impregnated a woman he had plucked from time, Marcus's mother, and Marcus was trapped in Limbo until he could be born on Earth. Marcus had basically brought Carol to Limbo, specifically mentioning that she actually reminded him of his mother, a little weird, and used charm and his father's subtle manipulation devices and methods to impregnate her so that he could be born on Earth. Yikes. In the end, despite the large piles of red flags, many piles of red flags everywhere, Carol decides randomly that she actually feels empathy for Marcus, not knowing whether this is coming from herself or actually from his influence over her, and her friends and colleagues, her family, the Avengers, just basically smile and wave goodbye as she rides off into the sunset with the man who she is most definitely a victim of. Her lover turned son turned sort of love once more, Marcus Immortus. Oh boy. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, and if you love when we talk about some of the more questionable things that have been done in comics, be sure to let us know by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9. Photon. While Monica Rambeau may finally be seeing some appreciation in the comics today, this wasn't always the case. I would say she started off with a bang in the comics, but then shortly after was kind of shafted multiple times over. Needless to say, she did recently get a 5-issue mini written by Eve Ewing, no relation to Al Ewing by the way, which I am super excited to read, but I personally think Monica deserves a whole ongoing series all her own. That's how awesome and powerful she is. Number 8. Rogue. So, I'm not going to lie, I actually love Rogue's weakness. Former weakness now, I guess. Rogue was one of my favorite characters growing up, and I think what I loved about her so much was the tragedy of her story and her powers. But what's even more, I love the way that Rogue overcame them in the comics. Still, in overcoming her fears to gain full control over her powers, Rogue actually became kinda harder to write, I think. She's just honestly too powerful. This is why I feel like we don't get as many Rogue-focused stories these days in the comics. Sure, she and Gambit have their team-up series going on, but I was really hoping for a Rogue solo story during the days of Krakoa. Jonathan Hickman planned to write one, but ultimately decided against it when he agreed to hand over creative control to his X-Men team, as opposed to staying in charge of the main plot of the Krakoa era as the head of X-Desk. I still really want that Hickman Rogue story, and I'm hoping that we get it, because yeah, I feel like there's so much more we could do with Rogue in the comics. Number 7. Jean Grey. Despite being written as a powerhouse in the comics, Jean has a long history of weird choices being made for her character. And also initially she was basically just written to be a damsel in distress for a lot of the early days of the X-Men. She has constantly been killed off, in some cases to advance the story of her male heroic counterparts, whether that be motivating them to take some action or simply kind of freeing them from their romantic obligation to her. Number 6. Wasp. Janet Van Dyne. In the Ultimate Universe, Janet wasn't treated very well, but I'd also argue in the main continuity, Janet has had it, honestly, pretty rough. Initially, she was kind of like the sidekick to Ant-Man, and then it was revealed that he was not mentally stable, meaning that Janet, as his wife, had to put up with a lot, considering that Hank was later believed to be undiagnosed bipolar. Not blaming Hank for his own mental illness here, but just acknowledging that as a result, Janet had a lot that she had to live with as his partner. And cope with. Eventually, the two do divorce, and then from a hero's perspective, Janet kind of slowly starts to fade away as Hank becomes less and less relevant. Number 5. Iska the Unbeaten. Iska is a super interesting character. On one hand, she's extremely powerful and can never lose. She can even potentially have her power utilized to manipulate the stakes of other competitions that she is pulled into herself. However, this also implies that there are times when she has zero control over her powers, in the sense that she cannot influence the result of an unbalanced battle. In fact, her powers will pull her to serve the side that will be victorious, regardless of whether or not she wants to, in terms of what her mind or her heart says to her. This means that Iska has been forced to turn her back on her own people, the mutants of Arakko, more than once. She's also had to fight against her own family and colleagues before as a result. Although the one thing she can control at times is how she fights in a battle, which I think is interesting. Meaning if she has the option, she can basically try to fight others involved as opposed to those that she's close to. Despite the fact that she has done her best by choosing her opponents to help mitigate how she might be used to turn the tide in a battle, she still is sometimes painted unfairly, I would say, as a villain, when really she is a strong warrior who simply sometimes has no say in terms of her allegiances thanks to her powers. I really hope we get to see more of her and get to dive more into how being forced to turn on her allies at times has truly, probably deeply affected her. Number 4. Wasp Nadia Van Dyne. Janet even got replaced basically by her adoptive daughter, a younger version of the Wasp, Nadia Van Dyne, who was actually Hank's biological daughter from his previous marriage, who, well, he basically never knew existed. Nadia returned to the US after escaping the Russian Red Room, only to find out that Hank had actually died. She ended up bonding with Janet and ultimately taking up the Wasp mantle with her blessing, also taking her last name as well. I don't mind too much that Nadia is also now the Wasp. I just wish that Janet could also remain relevant while this was going on. In fact, despite Nadia also being a cool new character, I don't even think that she has stayed very relevant since her very recent introduction to the comic, which is unfortunate as well. Wasp is so cool, but yet we can't have any wasps that are super important lately. Number 3. Madeline Pryor. I'm sure many of you at this point know how I feel about Maddie, but for those who don't, Madeline Pryor is basically the evil clone of Jean Grey, who initially wasn't evil at all. She's also been known before as the Goblin Queen. However, the fact that Maddie was always shafted and then eventually realized that the choices made in her life were manipulated and orchestrated into happening by Mr. Sinister prompted her to basically have a mental breakdown, honestly pretty reasonable, and turn on those who she had once called her allies and friends. That's when she ends up becoming the Goblin Queen. Number 2. Scarlet Witch. M-Day has to have been one of the worst moments in mutant history. M-Day happened in 2005 in the comics as a result of Scarlet Witch striking out at mutant kind after the events of House of M, where she attempted to create a reality where many heroes were happy, but after learning of its falseness, was once again rejected by all those she had actually tried to help here. Pretty devastating, especially when, while Wanda was warping reality here, she was doing so in an effort to not only defend herself, but also make herself and all of her friends happy. In fact, I would argue her friends and teammates, the Avengers, were somewhat, and in fact I would say just full on, complicit in what happened, since they never really reached out to Wanda to try and help her when she was struggling emotionally, prompting her to warp reality, which ultimately led to her wiping out almost all mutants during M-Day. And if you don't believe me that that is the case, I mean, there's literally an alternate reality where if Jessica Jones was there, pretty much none of this would have happened, so yeah. M-Day happened mainly because Wanda was striking out at her believed to be father at the time, Magneto, who she claimed loved mutant kind more than he did his own family. Wanda said the words "no more mutants," and with that small utterance, depowered or destroyed millions of mutants the world over. An action that would cement her as one of the greatest mutant villains in comics for years beyond, despite her long-standing history before this working as a hero. Number 1. Wasp Ultimates. Oh boy, probably the worst one, I would say. Pretty bad. Janet Van Dyne's death in the Ultimate Universe has to be, honestly, one of the worst things. First of all, we don't even show her enough respect to give her an on-panel death, as she drowns during the tidal wave in Ultimatum, one of the many poor victims who perished off-panel, despite, like many others, deserving an on-panel death. But really, when we're talking about those that deserved an on-panel death, Jan is really top tier. She's really high up there, especially considering Janet was actually the leader of the Ultimates at this point. So not only are we off to a bad start here, but then she also gets eaten by the Blob for some reason. It's also weird that they decided to make the Blob do this. I know he's a bad guy, I know he's a villain, but he isn't typically known to like be a cannibal anywhere else in the Marvel multiverse, pretty much ever. The Ultimate Universe had a weird and unhealthy obsession with cannibalism initially, at least, it felt like. That's about it. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.